quietly in her room while there was a thunderstorm outside the window. She didn't move when she heard a knock on the door. A moment later, Isabella entered the room with a smile and informed the young lady that it was time for a snack. She sighed heavily and told her nanny that during a war there was a shortage of food, so snacks were a luxury. Isabella said, "Madam, that you are the one and only emperor of the Eastern Empire, and she is his daughter." She said that the young princess was a role model, and she was sure that when the emperor returned, he would be pleased with her endeavors. But the princess knew that this was not so, because even if they were blood relatives, she only had the name he gave her at birth. It was the emperor who started the war when she was 6 years old. The war had been going on for several years and was not ending. The young princess looked intently out the window. A moment later, Isabella smiled and pushed forward a small piece of cake for the princess. She asked the princess not to worry, as the emperor would soon return from the battlefield. And she also told the princess not to worry, as she would protect her. The young princess sighed heavily and thanked her nanny for her support. She knew that if the magic had remained, she would have helped her father end the war. In the Eastern Empire, there was a legend that was passed down from generation to generation. Only in contrast to the true White Knight, an all-powerful witch of the White Knight appeared, who fulfilled all the wishes of people. And by some coincidence, this witch was she. The day when the full moon rose, someone sincerely made a wish. At that very hour, the witch of the White Knight fulfilled it, as it is said, in a new legend. Many people came to her with their best wishes. She listened carefully to everyone, because she was strong in the conclusions she had made. But for some reason, when she opened her eyes again, she saw a small bed. She lost her power, also lost her mother, and became the only daughter of a tyrant emperor. She was reborn and became a princess. The emperor, in turn, looked at his daughter with fury, since his beloved wife died because of her fault. He abandoned his daughter, still an infant, alone in a huge palace. She never saw her father's face in her entire life. Only Isabella cared for her with all sincerity. She was not about her and the person who truly loved the princess. Isabella looked at the lady with a gentle smile and told the lady that it was raining heavily outside today. She looked closely at the princess and said that in such weather she should be careful, as she could catch a cold. Alicia looked at her nanny intently, but said nothing. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the window, where a serious thunderstorm was breaking out. She froze for a moment when she heard a crash outside the window. A moment later, Isabella screamed, frightened by the lightning. The young lady, in turn, looked out the window in bewilderment. She was a little excited because she felt something, so she suddenly shuddered. Isabella walked up to the window with lightning speed and began to close it. She smiled and asked the princess when the war would end. A moment later, the princess sighed heavily and said that most likely the war would end soon. A few seconds later, they heard some kind of rumble. A moment later, a knight burst into their room and hurriedly called the princess. Isabella was in shock. She did not understand what happened and asked the knight how he could just burst into the princess's chambers. But the young knight in turn shouted that the emperor had died on the battlefield. Isabella froze in shock, as she did not expect this, but the young princess maintained her composure at that moment. She sighed heavily, as she had been left an orphan at her young age, but her lost magic returned in that same hour. The knight bowed and said that fortunately they had won the war, but in the final battle, the emperor had been defeated. The princess did not listen to the young knight and asked what his name was. He looked at her in surprise, introduced himself a moment later, and said that he was Chauvel. ISAP. The princess came up to the young man with lightning speed and said that she had missed one thing. He looked at her in bewilderment. Alicia looked at the knight and said that, whatever the case, entering the chambers of a royal person without knocking was extremely rude. She looked at him intently and said coldly that such was the law of the empire. The knight was taken aback and froze in place. He was shocked and wondered if the princess had ever been like this before. He quickly asked the princess for forgiveness. She, leaving, said that it was all because she was a princess, imprisoned in a palace. But that did not give him a reason to ignore the law. A moment later, she walked out of the room, but her nanny froze in shock, as she had not expected such a thing. After some time, a smile spread across her face, as she knew that the emperor had died and there were no other candidates for the throne except her. Isabella ran after her mistress in a hurry, not knowing where she was going. The young princess wondered if she should take the place of the emperor. Sometime later, the meeting of the ministers of the empire began. The men were shocked by everything that was happening, and so they wanted to find the emperor's relatives in order to put one of them on the throne. They knew that if they looked at the collateral branch of the imperial family, they would find someone. They cried out because they were puzzled, because they knew that when the emperor ascended the throne, he killed all his relatives. But a moment later, there was a loud explosion, and the doors to the hall flew apart with a roar. Unfortunately, the people who were next to the door also followed behind the door, all frozen in shock, as they did not understand what was happening at all. A moment later, the princess entered the hall and asked with a smirk why they were beating around the bush. Everyone was shocked by what they saw. Everyone present looked closely through the veil of smoke and saw the princess standing there. She, in turn, looked at them with a grin and said that she was a contender for the throne. The men were shocked and did not understand who she was to sit on the imperial throne. But the young princess did not take their words seriously. A moment later, the man shouted to everyone else to look at the color of her hair, as it was the same color as the emperor's. They were shocked because they saw her scarlet eyes, which the emperor had. They couldn't believe that in front of them now was a real princess. She asked with a smirk if they had only just realized this. She asked with a smirk if they had any problems. The man was furious and did not understand where it was possible to see a princess as an emperor, since he knew that she had been imprisoned in the palace all her life. He did not understand how a princess who never left the palace could become an emperor. She asked with cold fury what family he was from. The man froze for a moment from her cold gaze. She looked at him intently and asked his name. They were shocked because they knew she was too young, but they saw great potential in her. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was the Marquis de Marais of the Perhan family. The princess looked at him with a fierce grin and said that the level of ministers leading the country was very low. They were taken aback and wondered if it was really the emperor himself who was behind the princess. The princess said with a grin that it seemed like they needed an emperor who was like a puppet. The marquis was shocked and shouted that everything was not like that at all. She looked at them all intently as she realized that they were trembling in front of the child. Duke Arnold Herdev greeted the princess. The duke said that the only thing they were worried about was the ability of the imperial family. The duke said that the position of emperor required great effort and ability, and it was difficult to appoint a princess as emperor when there was no evidence of her ability. He also said that many regions were destroyed due to the war, and they should resolve this issue right now. He looked at her intently and asked if she could prove her worth as an emperor. The young princess said with a grin that it was very easy to do. After a few seconds, she used her magic. At that very moment, the duke began to float in the air. He was stunned and screaming, but she said that he would see everything with his own eyes and tell about everything that happened. The ministers were shocked by what was happening. They did not know if it was possible to teleport so quickly. They understood that there had been no magicians like her before. They knew that the emperor had also reached the level of a sword master at around the same age. For some time, they continued to whisper among themselves, but at the same time, Isabella trembled and looked at the place where the princess had been a few minutes ago. The young princess went with her companion to a suburban city in the Eastern Empire. After some time, she landed on the ground with her light force, but the duke fell with a crash. She was nervous, as this was her first experience using magic in many years. But everything went like clockwork. She believed that she had lost the entire sum of the orgy when she was reborn, and did not understand when she returned. She told the duke that she had moved them to the nearest town to the border. The princess saw that the city was very badly damaged, and the duke asked her in bewilderment what she intended to do. She sighed heavily and told the duke to just stand and watch. She slowly picked up a handful of earth, and after a few seconds, she used her magic. She understood that now, with just one wish, all their traumas would be healed, and the destroyed houses will be restored one after another. She knew that there would be plenty of food in the houses so that people could eat their fill and not get sick. Alicia looked at the renewed city with a gentle smile after she restored it. The residents were surprised, and at the same time happy that the city was completely restored, as were they. The duke at the same time was stunned by what he saw. He could not believe what had happened. But a moment later, the young princess disappeared along with her companion. Unexpectedly, just as she had appeared, everyone thought that a goddess was coming towards them from below. After some time, they returned to the castle. Everyone pounced on them, as they wanted to know where they had been. Alicia, with a satisfied smile, told everyone present that all the work to restore the border zone had been completed. The ministers were shocked because they knew that the war had ended only yesterday, and she had already managed to rebuild the city. The man looked at the duke intently and asked if the princess's words were true. The duke, in turn, was stunned and said that it was all true, and all the work in the border region was completed in an instant. He looked closely at all his comrades and said that the princess just waved her hand and restored everything. She turned around and walked away with a smile, knowing that they shouldn't make a fuss over such a small thing. But a moment later, she was taken aback and stopped, as she saw her nanny, who was standing in the same place. Alicia looked at the men hard and said she wouldn't ask them to confess, but they weren't to think she'd forgiven them. As she left, she told them with a smirk that they should just wait for her to surprise them. A moment later, the young princess was walking to her room with her nanny. Alicia looked closely at her nanny. As she could tell, she looked surprised. But she saw that the nanny did not tell her anything about what had happened. 9 years ago, destiny gave birth to a young princess in the midst of universal blessings. But the death of her mother, as well as the contempt of her father, changed her destiny. It all started with the anger of the imperial people. But young Isabella wondered what sin could have been committed by such a small life. She didn't want the young princess to remain alone all her life, so she decided to dedicate her life to her and become her family. Isabella believed that she knew the princess better than anyone else. She had been shocked by her look some time ago. She understood that when she looked at the princess, she saw a completely unfamiliar person, so she doubted that this was her princess. But at that very second, the young princess took her nanny by the hand and looked at her with a smile. Alicia asked the nanny with a smile if she was really that surprised by what happened. Isabella did not answer, but only called her mistress. The young princess looked at her in surprise. Isabella looked in my direction and said with a smile that the weather was very nice today. Isabella understood that it didn't matter at all who the princess was. She intended to live next to her always, and for this the princess thanked her. From that day on, everyone bowed their heads before the young princess, and the princess's abandoned palace was soon put in order. But the young princess did not stop gaining knowledge after everything that happened, because she started taking classes on succession for imperial persons. Due to the lack of education from early childhood, she had to quickly make up for lost time. She needed to get acquainted with all the sciences, but for an ordinary child, such a pace would be an unbearable burden. But for her, everything was in the order of things. She studied tirelessly. But suddenly, she heard someone knocking on her door. Moments later, she saw Sedelt, imperial advisor. He came to the title at the age of 17. Being the right hand of the emperor, he served the family for 7 whole years. She looked closely at the young man, for she knew that the tyrant emperor had not beheaded him, which meant that his value was great. The young man greeted the princess according to all the rules of etiquette. She also greeted him coldly in return. Sedelt said that he had carried out her orders, and the news of the emperor's death had not yet left the palace walls. She knew that in the current turbulent situation, it was better to keep such a thing to herself, so she said with a smile that the fewer people knew, the better. Sedelt was in shock, as he knew that the funeral had also been postponed as long as possible. She looked at the young man intently and asked if Devian had already arrived at the palace. He said that the young man was already waiting for her. A moment later, the young man entered the princess's office and greeted her with a smile. She looked at him in surprise and asked since when he started showing up on time. He was shocked. He didn't understand how she could say something like that. Devian said with a smile that he was always devoted to their activities. A moment later, he handed her a magic scroll, on which was drawn a magic circle that even the best scholars and magicians of the tower could not decipher. She looked closely at the scroll in question. But a moment later, the princess looked at him and asked if he was making fun of her. She asked in surprise if he had really decided to teach her this. She knew that every time he hoped for her answer. Devian said with a smile that he would like to have the answer to this riddle. But a moment later, he saw her burn the scroll. He was shocked and couldn't believe what he saw. Devian smiled and said that luckily he was familiar with her character and had saved a copy so she could see how serious he was about their studies. Alicia sighed heavily and said that he had to give her the scroll. A moment later, he watched her write her reply, his eyes fixed on her hopefully. He looked at the young princess and said that the emperor was one of the few swordmasters in the world. He looked at her intently and said that the news of his death would cause a storm of emotions, as he had heard that the king of another country had used black magic. He said that during the battle between the emperor and the enemy king, a huge black wave fell on the emperor. Thus, this wave caused a powerful explosion. The princess asked in surprise what happened next. He said that after the explosion, the emperor disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing behind. Devian said that a search party was sent out, but he was never found, so the emperor was declared killed in action. Isabella smiled and wished the young princess sweet dreams and left. Alicia pretended to be asleep for a while, but after a few minutes she got up. She looked closely at the documents that lay on her desk. She felt very sorry for her nanny, but she knew that since she had made it clear to everyone that she would become emperor, she had to give it her all. The young princess looked closely at the documents. She knew that children were being kidnapped in the empire right now. Alicia, in turn, was puzzled, as it seemed to her that there was something suspicious about this case. She looked into the distance with a grin, as she knew that now was the time for a child to walk through the streets of the village. After some time, she visited the village. The young princess looked into the distance as she saw empty streets, but she knew she had to use magic to find the children. A moment later, she used her magic and began to comb through the village. Her magic spread for many miles, and after a few minutes, she found the house where the children were. She cast her magic a little lower and noticed the men who were guarding the dungeon. But after a few minutes, she went down even lower and noticed the children themselves in the damp dungeon. The young princess was very happy, as her search was crowned with success. After some time, she visited the dungeon where the children were. The boy looked at the young lady in surprise and wondered if it was really an angel in front of him now. She looked at him intently and gestured for him to be quiet. She smiled and said that she would definitely save them, but they had to behave quietly. After a few seconds, she looked back. The princess was a little surprised because your report only listed 6 missing children, but there were more. A moment later, she used her magic and thereby opened all the doors of the dungeons. She looked closely at the children and wondered if they had decided to turn the children into slaves. She was furious, but then she noticed how the young guards came running at the noise. They were alarmed, because they did not understand why the cages were open. But a moment later, they were taken aback as they noticed that the girl had made her way towards them. Alicia looked at them with cold fury and used her magic. A few seconds later, the young men were bound in magical chains, and they fell to their knees on the ground with a crash. Alicia turned around and looked at the children, saying that they were free and asking if they were going to go home. She looked at all the freed children in surprise, as she didn't understand what was wrong with them. Looking at the young savior, they said that they did not know the way home. She sighed heavily. The young princess became indignant. Back to the castle. She froze for a moment when she heard her nanny's voice. Isabella quickly rushed to her mistress and with tears in her eyes asked where the princess was. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had been away for a while she had raided an illegal trade. Isabella looked at her mistress with alarm and called her. The princess was in shock, did not understand what was happening, and asked her nanny who had offended her. Isabella sighed heavily and said that she had been serving one man for many years, and her unaccompanied expeditions worried her. Isabella said that it would be very good if she warned her about her expeditions, and also told her about her location. The princess sighed heavily and said that from now on she would tell her everything. Isabella smiled brightly at her mistress and said that it seemed to be a promise made by the princess. The next day Sedelt greeted the princess. She asked why he was looking for her. The young man said that the ministers were waiting for her in the conference room. She was surprised, as she did not expect this. Sedelt said they conveyed that they had something important to tell her. She assumed it would be about her coronation. She said that she had been showing them her ability and skills lately. She looked at the young man and called him. He shuddered. The princess looked at him intently and asked if he was faithful to her. She knew that until now he had been restless in carrying out her orders, but she could not say with certainty that he was devoted to her. She knew that he was the emperor's man and loyal to the crown. The princess sighed heavily and said that she would immediately understand whether he was telling the truth or a lie. Sedelt knelt before the princess and said that he could do only one thing for the peace and well-being of the empire, and that was to serve the son of the empire. She looked at him intently, because she knew that he would not disappoint her, so that was enough for her. Alicia told the young man that one of the palace servants had recently received good money for information he had given about what was happening in the palace. Sedelt sighed heavily and said that it was his fault, but the princess didn't think so. She said she had caught him, and he was now in prison, so the young man had to find out who he was paying for the information. She smiled and said that they were finished with that, and now she could go to the ministers who were waiting for her. At the same time, there was complete chaos in the conference hall, but a moment later the ministers fell silent. They saw the princess. According to the rules of etiquette, everyone greeted the princess. Alicia, in turn, simply walked past them. She sat on the throne and looked casually at everyone present and asked them to get down to business. The duke bowed to the young princess and asked her to become their son and dispel the darkness of the empire. They looked at her intently and, bowing, asked her to become their emperor. Alicia looked at everyone present and a moment later called the Minister of Finance. The man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she wanted from him. Alicia looked at the man intently and said that it was time for them to begin preparing for the coronation. Some time later, Isabella was preparing her mistress for bed. Alicia looked closely at her nanny. Isabella smiled and asked the princess if she was very tired. Alicia knew that the emperor had imprisoned her, and then everyone turned away from her. But the only person remained next to her, protecting her. She looked closely at her nanny and called her. Isabella smiled and asked the princess what she wanted to say. Alicia sighed heavily and told her nanny that she would soon become emperor. In a place that was no different from a birdcage, only Isabella cared for the young lady. Isabella looked at her intently, but with a gentle smile, she told her mistress that she would always be by her side. Isabella looked at the princess with a tender smile and said that she would follow her wherever she went. Alicia thanked her nanny with a tender smile, knowing that she was her only family. Isabella told her mistress that if anyone betrayed the will of Her Majesty, she would be the first to maim him and cut off his head. Alicia looked at her faithful nanny with a joyful smile. Isabella looked closely at her mistress and informed her that she was already ready to go out. The young lady looked at her nanny and said that it was time for them to begin. Isabella looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that she was the most beautiful in the world. Alicia smiled and asked if this was true. Isabella noticed the change on her mistress's face and asked if she was really uncomfortable in her outfit. Alicia smiled and said that she was truly happy now. Isabella smiled a joyful smile and told her mistress that she too had been happy in serving her. Alicia looked closely at her nanny as she was glad for her support. But a moment later, Isabella informed her mistress that she was ready. Alicia sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to begin. She knew that after 9 terrible years she would finally come out into the world. A moment later, everyone present greeted the young princess. She looked at everyone intently, as she knew that she would soon receive the crown. She saw how everyone who attended him bowed to her. She knew that after so many years she would be seen as an empress, not a princess. Alicia was clearly aware that right now she would become the new son of the empire. A moment later, the priest began to hand over the crown to the new emperor. But after a few seconds they heard a loud roar. Everyone was shocked as they saw the door explode. The ministers fled in all directions as the walls collapsed. The young princess, in turn, used magic to protect herself and the priest, who held the crown tightly. She knew it was a magical wave, and not everyone was capable of something like that. A moment later, the emperor entered the hall and said angrily that in his absence, some fearless little thing had wanted to take his place. He looked at his daughter with cold fury. He looked at her closely and said that Anna had a rather interesting face. The ministers were frozen in shock as they could not believe that the emperor was alive. In a hurry, everyone began to shout and call for the emperor. The priest, in turn, was puzzled because he did not know what to do. The young princess was puzzled because she only wanted to become the new son of the empire, but her plan came to naught. Alicia asked her father for forgiveness with a grin, as she had never seen his face and therefore did not know if it was him. The emperor was shocked. She greeted him with a smile. She bowed and introduced herself, but he walked past her and told her to get lost. Alicia sighed heavily and told her father that he had a truly nasty character. A moment later, the emperor threw the crown to the ground. She looked at her father, puzzled, and asked if she had said that out loud. The emperor turned around with lightning speed and looked at her with fury. But at the same time, he put his sword to her throat, because she dared to insult the emperor. She said with a grin that the empire was now, unfortunately, in complete chaos, and being a princess, She could not stay away. He said with fury that he saw that even death did not frighten her, and it seemed that she was a complete fool. Alicia said with a smile that he was very funny. She pushed his sword away and said that if the truth were to be told, he had already decapitated her with that ball. She looked intently at everyone present and said that her father was tired from the long journey. Alicia asked with a smirk, how about Togo passing the throne to the younger generation and retiring? The emperor looked closely at his daughter and said that it seemed she really did want to be beheaded. She bowed and said with a smile that if this was what her father wanted, she could not resist such a thing.